Dr. Cooley is the President Emeritus of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. As the president, he was instrumental from its earliest days, and he brought the school through some challenging times to some of its highest heights. And during his tenure as president, he learned some very valuable lessons about leadership, which I'm hoping he can pass along to us today. Not everything about leadership is personally rewarding. In fact, there can be some significant challenges, but if you're going to be a leader, you have to take the upside and the downside together. Well, Dr. Cooley, thank you so much for leading us in this discussion, and we've got some questions that we'd like to ask you. First of all, as a leader, what kinds of things have given you your greatest satisfaction, and what aspects of leadership did you find the most rewarding?
Thank you, Dr. Sullimore, for this opportunity to discuss one of my favorite topics, and that is leadership. As I reflect upon the past many years in exercising leadership, I think my greatest satisfaction came from working with people. The variety of people groups always presented a challenge, so that one could not have just a monolithic style, but one had to understand the context of the leadership to be rendered. And so in working with trustees or faculty, administration and staff, students, donor groups, professional organizations, and so on, each one represented a different character, a different type of people group. And being a people person, I've enjoyed the time spent in this variety of people groups. So I came to understand that enjoyable leadership depends upon the enjoyment of people.
Have there been times when leadership has not been that enjoyable?
Yes, obviously, there always comes a moment in a leader's life when hard decisions have to be made. And contrary to what some would like for you to do, you know, in the best interest of the school or the organization, you have to make that decision. So that's why I often speak of leadership as splendid agony.
Well, in your estimation, what would you say are some of the most important activities that leaders do in organizations?
I think first and foremost is the capacity to build trust. If one is going to be effective in their leadership, they must create a trustable environment so that information, communications, decisions are well understood by an entire group of people that are going to be involved. And so I think creating trust is the very first thing. Second, I think it's incumbent upon leaders to be responsible for defining reality. And this is why leadership varies from one opportunity to another, because the context varies. And so leadership must define reality if the group or the organization is going to move forward. One cannot assume the starting block. One has to define that starting block. And that means to understand the reality of the organization. I think a third quality that's important is the capacity to discern the issues, to understand the issues of the day. And this involves understanding the context, not only the micro context, but certainly the macro environment needs to be understood, because there are forces blowing upon an organization that can be disruptive, and they call for an adaptive response. And that's one way I see leadership, as being an adaptive form of responding to these kinds of disruptive threats. So Discerning the issues of the day and defining them becomes essential. Then I think it's important to cast vision. The leader of any organization not only has to have a foot in the past, but they need to have the other foot in the future. And so they become the gateway to vision, strategic planning, and looking towards the future of that organization. So they are the facilitator of that vision casting responsibility. And then I think the capacity for executive leadership. Leaders in most organizations should not enter into management, but they should learn the art of delegating authorities and holding other persons responsible and accountable. So the capacity to delegate and to execute leadership, I think, is an important capacity. So I think I would put these 5 as probably the most important capacities to lead.
So you'd make a clear distinction between leadership and management?
I make a clear distinction because leadership requires courage to act, whereas management is maintaining the status quo. It's managing the understood policies and procedures. And if a leader is a manager, then they're stuck in business as usual. And so I see quite a distinction.
Okay, good, thanks. Now, Dr. Cooley, in your years as a leader of Gordon Conwell and in your writings, you reflect on things which you call the burdens of leadership that all leaders have to assume. Can you share a little bit about those?
Leaders, by the very nature of their calling to a position, carry certain burdens that only they have. One is the burden of loneliness. A leader can often be caught between a board and a constituency that is being led. Or a leader, at the end of the day, is left with some very hard decisions that only they can make. So that the capacity to deal with loneliness, even though you're with people all day long or in any enterprise, to deal with that kind of loneliness, it becomes a burden, and you need to work at that. I think another burden is what I would call accumulated grievance, particularly for leaders who serve an organization over a long period of time. They have to make a number of executive decisions that impact people's personal lives. And obviously, you have grievances along the way that you didn't make the right decision or you impacted somebody's personal way of doing something. And you accumulate that. Most people may forgive, but they don't forget.
Yes.
And so there's an accumulation, I think, of grievances that you carry. And so the longer you serve, the larger the burden comes with that accumulation. And then on one of the delightful sides, there is the burden of ceremony. As people groups, we like to celebrate our organizations. And celebrations become a means whereby we communicate our statements of mission and our purposes, our core values. But it's always the leader's responsibility to plan those ceremonies. Several organizations miss opportunities to advance their organization because they do not pay attention to ceremony. And so I think that becomes a burden. I think the burden of initiative. One of the dangers we always face in an organization is obsolescence. Practices, policies, functions, services can become out of date. And yet, through tradition, we carry them on, and they become obsolete. And sometimes it requires the leader to exercise an executive judgment to begin to address obsolescence. And this impacts people's lives, how an organization functions. And so that becomes a burden of initiative that can get quite heavy. And then among, I think, some of the other burdens that we deal with, we always have to remember that we can cast and carry each other's burdens. And so I have found in leadership, it's always good to have a good team around you that are working with you. They understand the perspectives, the objectives, and are working with you. And that then broadens out. And that helps then the carrying of these kinds of burdens. So these are just a few to give you an insight, I think, of some of the pressures that a leader can carry.
Dr. Cooley, my final question has to do with biblical metaphors for leadership. Which of those in the Old and New Testament do you think are the most relevant for leaders today?
I think getting the right leadership model together with the right context becomes most important. You take, for example, Joseph represents what I would call a positional model. Joseph went from one level of leadership in Potiphar's household to another position of leadership in prison, to another leadership level in the household of Pharaoh. And if you study each one of those aspects of his leadership, that his position and the context come together, and he was the right leader in the right place at the right time. And so this serves as a good model for positional leadership. On the other hand, if we take a visionary leader as an example, Nehemiah, certainly when he surveyed the conditions of the fallen walls of Jerusalem and established a plan whereby the Judeans could rebuild those walls and establish then the defenses of the city. Here you see the setting out of a vision, you see the strategy that went into the planning, and then you see how he executed that plan. So Nehemiah represents a visionary form of leadership, but the right context in which to exercise this. There's another form that I call ethical leadership. This is leading by the word of your mouth. There are just some organizations and situations that need an outstanding communicator in their leader, one who can speak to inspire, but also to be prophetic in addressing the issues of the day. Certainly Elijah, a lonely person, and yet in the context of King Ahab and others, he certainly was a prophetic leader. And this represents a little different kind, but one that sometimes a context calls for. Or we can look certainly at, say, power leadership. There are those moments when an authority figure is needed to bring order back to an organization, to bring it out of a crisis. And certainly Samuel represents a power leader. As Israel was looking all over for another leader, for a king, Samuel had to warn them of the problems that they were looking forward to in calling for a king. And so he still had to exercise authority in that context to bring that about in the election of a king and seeking out King Saul to be the first king of Israel. So power leadership becomes very important. But probably one of the best examples of team leadership is to be found with Moses. You remember his Arab friend Jethro advised him to get organized and to delegate the work to groups of 10, 50, 100, and 1,000 and share that work. And then Moses should take unto himself only the hard questions. So a form of team leadership becomes important. So in the Old Testament, you have a whole series of different models, but those models are defined by the context in which they are exercised. When we come into the New Testament period, we have really shifted out of a Near Eastern cultural context into a Greco-Roman, more classical context. And there we see leadership being exercised in different ways. Certainly Jesus exercised leadership as a transformational leader. When we look at Paul and his statements about leadership, they really were about ministry, not leadership. I think in Paul's mind, ministry was equated with exercising leadership. And so he spoke of himself as a servant of Christ. And he talked about co-workers serving with him. And so I think Paul's view of leadership was service and ministry. But in the New Testament, we have 4 metaphors that help us to understand certain dimensions of leadership. Certainly the image of a shepherd stands well to understand pastoral leadership, leadership that is caring and looks after the welfare of the organization, and in a pastoral fashion. The shepherd becomes an excellent metaphor of this kind of leadership. Then you have servant leadership. We hear a lot about that these days. And there is a dimension that's important to servant leadership, and that's humility. That there is no task beyond the leader, that service to be rendered becomes a critical call upon that kind of leadership. And then you have steward leadership. New Testament speaks about being overseers, good managers, good executives, good controllers. There is a dimension in leadership that demands an executive capacity of an overseer. And so the image of a steward. And then finally, the New Testament uses the seer or the prophet, the one who sees the future, speaks the future, and brings the word of the Lord to bear upon that future. So being a seer or an ethical leader, as I've mentioned, becomes an important metaphor for understanding. And I think, Dr. Salomar, what's important is there's no one right metaphor or one right model. It's all regulated by the context, the need of the people, the congregation, the organization, and they need to understand the nature of the leadership that they need and provide for that in their selection or their call to leadership. So the context relationship helps to define leadership.
Dr. Cooley, thank you so much for the time that you took out of your busy schedule to be with us and to share your wonderful wisdom on leadership and to help us train the next generation of leaders, which is what we do here at Gordon Conwell. And I hope that some of these students viewing this today will get an opportunity to meet you in person.
Good, and thank you, Dr. Salomar, for allowing for this conversation, and I wish you and all well.
Thank you.